Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. I think we can say good morning. We can say good afternoon. We can say good evening. We got people from all over the place. It's so awesome. I'm Hamza. I'm with the Small Giants community, and it's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces and also some new ones. If you are new to the Small Giants community, we are a fun, casual, and conversational bunch. So we would love to see you if you can be on camera, but that's okay if you can't. We are certainly going to be chatting a lot, and this is going to be conversational and participatory. And so we would love to hear from you throughout this conversation via chat. And there'll also be prompts for you to chime in. So you could use the raise the hand feature, which is actually under reactions. And then there'll be prompts and questions and an opportunity for you to chime in. And we'd love to hear from you throughout this conversation. We'll share a couple of announcements just of upcoming events at the end of this call. So we hope you stay with us for the hour. And I do have a couple of colleagues on the call as well from the Small Giants community. I have Bridget and I have Annie, and they're on the call as well. With that, I am so excited to introduce Amber Johnson. Amber is a leadership and strategy consultant. She's also the former Chief Communications Officer at the Center for Values-Driven Leadership at Benedictine University. She's also working on an awesome book, which she's going to talk a little bit about, and it's also what this work is about. And we are super excited to have her. She has spoken at a Small Giants conference before and has contributed to a lot of our content. And I think you are in for a treat. So with that, I'm excited to introduce Amber. Amber, the floor is yours.
All right. Hey, everyone. So good to see you. I see some familiar faces and names, and I won't call you out by name, but know that I see you. I'm really excited that you're here to hang with us today. And I think that if we took a second and I asked you, why did you show up for a session on asking better questions? You're probably here because you know the importance of questions. You probably know that, for example, when you ask better questions, people seem to like you more. This is just kind of an average thing we know. If you go on a first date and somebody doesn't ask a question about you, it's a really bad sign. And I had that first date. Maybe you did as well. So research tells us, and our life confirms, that asking increases liking. And research also tells us that asking helps us learn better. It's the Socratic method. That sometimes the best way to learn something isn't to download a whole bunch of information as if for computers, but instead it's to ask a really good question and then probe at the edges of it and really wrestle with it until we figure things out. So asking increases liking, it advances learning, and we also know from research that asking increases performance. Some of my favorite research ever, and some of you here today are probably familiar with it, was inside a business, and they took teams that they knew were high-performing teams, they took teams they knew were perfectly average, and they took teams they knew were pretty terrible. And then they just recorded the teams' conversations, and they found some fascinating things. And one of the most fascinating things they found is that on the high-performing teams, every time somebody really argued for a perspective or advocated for their idea, for every one time that happened, there was a question asked. One question for every piece of advice that was offered, for every argument that was made, for every bit of advocacy that was put out there. An equal ratio of questions to advancing your own perspective. They got really curious. That was the high-performing teams. The low-performing teams had 20 direct statements, advice giving, advocating for their own position for every one question they asked. So we know that asking questions increases our performance as well. And I think you're probably here today because you know these things. You know instinctively that asking good questions leads to these sorts of results. And so the problem we have is not that we don't understand the importance of questions. The problem is that we keep asking bad ones. We keep asking things like, "How are you?" And we get the answer, "Fine." We could be making faster progress on our work and building stronger relationships if only we were asking better questions. And so today, my sole objective is to help you think about what better questions look like. And this is going to be an interactive session. I hope you'll interact with me through chat or through raising your hand and asking questions. And your first opportunity to do that starts now. I want to hear the story of a great question. And I know the email that you got late last week kind of prompted this to tell me the story of a great question in your life. And so I'd love it if somebody has one, if you'd raise your hand or if you would put it into chat, a question that really sort of changed the way you think about things, that helped you think about things differently. Maybe we can learn something about the value of good questions. And while you're thinking about that, a question that has really helped you, I'll share a story of one in my life. A few years ago, I was thinking about making a career change, and I had a hard time figuring out what I wanted. Maybe you've been there. It's hard to know what you really want. And in wrestling with this, I started talking with a friend, and a friend said, "Well, what would you do if you weren't afraid?" And that question just cut through all of the morass I've been swimming in. And I realized I knew exactly what I would do if I weren't afraid. I would take this risk. I would put myself out there in a different way. I would go for this new thing. But instead of thinking about that, I'd just been thinking about all of the risks that were there. And so by asking that question of what I would do if I wasn't afraid, my friend helped me think, oh, since I know what I do actually want, maybe I can think about how to minimize risk in the process, or how to create a little bit of a safety net so I feel safer. It totally transformed it, shifted my perspective and the way I was thinking. So do any of you have a question that's done that for you over time? Maybe something your mom asked, or a colleague asked, or a friend when you were wrestling with something? You can come off mute and share. Anybody's got one? All right, Luis. Lou.
Yeah, I can't be on camera right now, but a question that someone's asked me was, what are you celebrating at the moment? And that just kind of changed because I was like really grumpy, or I don't know why, but that question just like kind of changed the whole attitude. Like instead of like, how are you doing, or what's going on in your life at the moment, asking, what are you celebrating? Changed things.
That is such a good one, especially because our tendency when we get together with people sometimes is to complain, right?
Exactly.
I love that. I love that. And I love that you could ask that in a big moment, but you could also ask it in little moments in life. You could ask it just, over a glass of wine when you meet up with a friend. That's
exactly.
great.
I think my answer was my puppy was actually not weeing in the house. So it was like something super small, but it's something that I celebrated in my life right at that moment.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then that leads to a follow-up question. Why is that important right now? I love it. That's terrific. Thank you. And we've had a couple of others here in chat as well. I love the one, what if you get everything you want? Ooh. Oh, well then what am I measuring my happiness on if it's not based on the things that I'm getting? That's a good shifting of the perspective, a good imagine question. Someone says they had a mentor who once asked them to finish the phrase, if only I could blank, I would blank. Man, that's a great one. Come up with like 5 different responses to that and see which one sticks with you throughout the day. That's fabulous. Or a retreat leader that asked, who are you worried about in your life right now? And it helps you build compassion. I love it. I love all of these thoughtful questions. Thank you so much for sharing those. Feel free to keep sharing them. Sometimes the answer to tell me the story of a great question doesn't come to mind right away. But I think what you'll see in the questions that you've shared here is that those questions helped you move into a space where you could look at things differently. You could see a different perspective, and they helped you move into a space where you could imagine different possibilities and think about something differently. And that's what a good question can do. So in a little bit, we're going to talk about how to make that happen. But first, let me tell you how I kind of came to be thinking about questions more seriously. I've been a lover of good questions for a long time, sort of a collector of them, if that's fair to say. But a few years ago, it was really brought home to me because I have teenagers, and I was driving with my oldest, and we were taking a 12-minute drive to the hairdressers to get Sam's hair cut. And rather than talk to me, Sam had opted to read a book in the car. If you have teenagers, you've probably been there in that moment where they just won't even spend 12 minutes. And so I was trying to make conversation, and I was asking questions like, how's your book? Is that the second book in the series? And I was barely getting grunts as responses. And then we walk into the salon, and Sam sits down in the chair, and Vita, who cuts Sam's hair, starts trimming the hair. And I, from about 10 feet away, start overhearing their conversation. And Sam is just chattering away in a way that's very unusual for my oldest. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. And so I started listening to the questions that Vita was asking Sam. She was also asking questions about the book Sam had brought in, but this was the question she asked. What kind of characters do you like? Oh, well, that's a different question. It can't be answered with one word, right? It forces you to connect different things. It reveals something about yourself, about what you like emotionally, what you like intellectually, what makes you smile. And she was getting all of that out of Sam. I was jealous, quite frankly. And I started thinking about how can I ask my kids better questions so I get these better conversations? What would it look like to have better relationships because I just asked better questions? So for the last 4 years, I've been digging in pretty solidly into this area of research. What makes for better conversations? What makes for better questions? And I'm guided a little bit by this quote from William Isaac in his book, Dialogue. Isaac says, the most important part of any conversation are those neither party could have imagined before starting. How can we get to those ideas in conversation at work or at home that are things that I couldn't have thought of, even when I'm the leader of my organization, that I couldn't have thought of before I started? Well, I think questions are the pathway to that. You have to learn to ask questions whose answers you cannot yet imagine. And when we do, we find that better questions lead to better relationships and better results. That's what we're really after. So the questions don't have to serve us in our objective of getting better relationships and better results. So as Himsa mentioned, I'm working on a project that I call Better Than Fine, getting more out of the questions we ask, starting with how are you? Our questions, we should not be held hostage anymore to the tyranny of our bad questions. We need to learn to ask better ones to get better results and better relationships. And to get started, we have to first identify when we have a conversation that really needs attention because our questions aren't serving us any longer. So when are your questions not serving you any longer? When are you not getting the relationships or the results you want out of them? And I like to say that that happens when your conversations are in the ruts. And so I'm going to walk you through these ideas I have for what it means for a conversation to be in the ruts. And I would invite you to share examples in chat so that we can discuss them if you have an example of one of these conversations. We're going to actually start with that S because it's the how are you question. It's scripted. So our conversations are in the ruts when the S is scripted, when we ask a question and we know the answer we're going to get. How are you? Busy. How are you? Good. My husband and I used to respond to that question in the middle of the day with busy, fine, whatever. And we would call it the BFW response, which just means, we're not even trying here. We're just getting these predictable results. So if you find that you have a conversation that's scripted all the time, it always goes exactly the same way, that's a time to look at a better question. The second category are topics that are tense, topics that you're anxious about. And when we are anxious about a conversation, we have a tendency to do one of two things. Either we avoid having the conversation, which is usually my preferred path, or when I finally work up the nerve to have it, I just sort of rush right into it with sort of a rip the Band-Aid off approach without really thinking about how to approach the topic. And that leads to unpredictable and unsatisfying results. So that's a conversation that's in the ruts. The next kind of category of conversations that are often in the ruts are the uncertain ones, the ones that you avoid having or the ones you're anxious to have because you're not sure an answer exists or we don't know how to figure it out. In the early days of the pandemic, I saw so many leaders in these moments of uncertainty. They didn't know how to have the conversation about the future of their organizations. Now we're feeling the same way about how to get people back in the office, and we seem to be struggling to ask the right questions there. But it could also be something like, what's the competitor's new strategy? That's something I don't know. So how can I have a unique conversation about it? Well, you're going to need a better question. That's how you can have it. And the final conversations that are in the ruts are questions that are routine. And these are conversations that aren't scripted. The conversation may be a little different, but it's a conversation you just have all the time. And therefore you sort of let it go on autopilot without putting real thought into it. It is the agenda for your weekly meeting that never changes, despite the fact that your work is seasonal or the people on your team change or the needs might be different now than they were a month ago. It's also the weekend conversation you have with your spouse as you try to figure out who's fixing supper on what nights of the week, and you can tell you need a system, but you never quite go out to figure it. Those are conversations that are routine. We have the same conversation regularly. It goes differently each time, but it never gets any better. So are any of you having conversations that are in the ruts, that are routine, uncertain, tense, or scripted? I see some heads nodding. And if you have an example, I see a yes in the chat. If you have an example, I'd love for you to drop it into chat. I know it takes a little bit of vulnerability, but frankly, anybody who wasn't nodding their head was lying. And therefore, we can just all accept ourselves as humans and be vulnerable in this space. Anytime we have a conversation that feels routine, uncertain, tense, or scripted, it's a sign that we need to be more thoughtful about our questions, that our questions aren't serving us, and that we could get stronger relationships, better results if we just paid attention to that signal and asked better questions over time. So if you can think of a few conversations, again, drop those into chat. Maybe write a few down on your own notes. You don't have to share them with us, but write them down for yourself. And then as we move through this content, see if there's something that you could apply. And one final note about the ruts, it's very possible, extremely possible, common daily occurrence actually, to both be uncertain and tense at the same time, or to be routine and tense at the same time. These are not mutually exclusive categories. There's a lot of overlap. All right, so now you know how to find the conversations that need better questions. How do you actually make the conversations better? And that's where we want to spend our time, because identifying the problems are usually easy. It's thinking and using our imagination to think of the results that's a lot harder. So that's where we're going to spend our time today. And again, I want to encourage you, drop notes and comments into chat so that we can keep this a little interactive. That would be great. So how do we make these conversations better? You've all heard of Maslow's hierarchy. It is a theory of human motivation. And that theory of human motivation says we're motivated first by providing for our very basic physical needs. We've got to have shelter, we've got to have food, we've got to have water. And then we're motivated to make sure we're safe in the midst of those. And if we can feel safe, then we can build on that and hope for love and belonging and be motivated by achieving that. And then finally, we want esteem, a sense of earning the trust and respect of others. And if we're really lucky, we get to this point of self-actualization where we feel like we're accomplished. We're using our gifts in an optimized way. This is Maslow's hierarchy. No doubt you had a class on it in college. And you probably know and recognize that it gets progressively harder, but also progressively more important as you work up the chart. We want to be able to think of the same thing. What's our hierarchy of better questions? How could we take that question of asking what your team's bandwidth is, that Misty says, and transform it into something that actually leads to a really generative conversation? And how could we think about moving up the chart a little bit, up that pyramid, to get progressively harder, but also progressively more important? So I've been working to come up with a pyramid of better questions, and I'd like to walk you through this today with a bunch of examples. I'll pause for questions at a few points, but I'd love to also pause for stories. So send a note in chat or raise your hand if you have one. But we're going to look at these 3 at a time. We're going to start at the bottom with the first 3, and then we'll take a break and look for some examples and interact a little, and then we'll come back to the next one. And I hear you, Tom, about conversations with a kid, even an adult kid, about being in the rut. And you just keep circling around the same problems and never quite weaving out of them. So there's maybe today you'll find a question you could ask that might move you out of that sort of cycle of focusing on problems and not getting to where you need to go. All right, let's look at the first one, which is to be positive, that the question is positive. And what I mean by this is a few things. One, that it shows positive regard, which means that we assume the best of the other person. We assume the other person has a valid perspective and we're seeking to understand it. Even when we're locked in a disagreement, we don't think that person is being intentionally malicious or intentionally unreasonable. We acknowledge that they maybe had plans and thoughts that we aren't yet seeing or understanding. They have a valid perspective. So that's showing positive regard. But then you can take positive a step further and frame the question positive, to be looking for strengths and possibilities instead of negatives, but calling on failures or weaknesses or looking backward. And so we can use some examples here, and for each of these, I'll try to offer several. And you'll see that what's happening in these examples quite often is we're taking a negative circumstance and flipping it from what we don't want to what we do want. So let's look at one. The first one, I don't know, maybe I'm the only one who's ever attempted to say this, but is what were you thinking? That question obviously not showing positive regard if you say it with the tone that I just said it with. So how could we say it in a way that shows positive regard? We could say, okay, unpack that for me. It's a very simple shift, but instead of saying it with blame or judgment, we're saying, okay, explain it to me. I trust that you've got something here. Jennifer just offered a great suggestion in chat. Let me understand where you're coming from. And the tone you say it with is going to be important. I want to understand your thought processes. Exactly. I understand that I may be missing something. Help me explain it. Explain it to me. Maybe you're in an organization that just feels like there's so much red tape to make any decision, and you might rant to your colleague, why is there so much red tape? And that may be true. Sometimes that's even a roughly productive thing to say, but it's probably a more productive, it will move you in the direction of results. If you ask something like, how do we make this more efficient? I don't want red tape, I do want efficiency. So how do we make this more efficient? How do I find the things I do want in this? All right, and then let's say you've got a team that put together an event, a client event last week, and it bombed, it didn't go well. And you want to ask what went wrong at Thursday's event? Okay, that's a question, but somebody's going to feel blamed in that. Is there a way to frame it positively that we could acknowledge that we're learning for the future? You might say instead, if we did this again, what would we do differently? So you're just flipping it from blame about the past to learning for the future. Positive regard. What were the lessons learned exactly as we're getting in chat? Thank you for everybody who's sharing your suggestions. I love it. So I'm going to ask a question, and I'd love it if somebody just come off mute to respond. Let's say a director report was late for a meeting with the CEO. So, I'm this person's boss. They were late for a meeting with the CEO. That was not a good thing. And what I really want to say is, what were you thinking? How could you possibly not show up on time to this huge meeting? But you want to show positive regard because maybe there's a good reason. How can you ask a question that shows positive regard and is framed positively instead of shaming? Is there anybody who's got a flip on that? Just come off mute.
I just usually try to ask the question, hey, what happened today? And just be a little bit more curious. I think there's much to improve on that, but that's generally my approach.
Yeah. Hey, what happened today? Yeah. You're acknowledging, inviting an explanation. That's great. Thank you. Yeah. Terrific. I know an organization where they asked this kind of question and they discovered somebody got really bad news right before walking into that meeting, and they needed a minute to catch their breath so they could show up as their best selves. Make space for that, right? All right. Okay, so that's our first one. We're asking positive questions. Next, we need to make sure that our questions are really open. And I probably don't need to explain open and closed questions to you. Closed questions have a fixed response. It's either yes or no, true or false, something simple like that. And it's important, it gives you information, but it doesn't give you understanding always. And so we want to try to open things up. And but what we often think of is that it's a binary, open and closed, and instead it's really more of a continuum. You can have radically open questions, things that really encourage you to stretch and think. And so in getting to better questions, we've got to take a closed question and make it open, and then take an open question and see if we can push the edges of it a little bit more. There's a famous example that comes from a book I love, and it was of a doctor talking to a patient. Imagine you're a busy doctor, you rush into the exam room to see a patient who's clearly in pain, and your question is, you're experiencing pain. Well, okay, yes, not exactly helpful, right? So you could make it more open or if you go back to Vita's question, or my question with Sam in the book, do you like that book? Okay, yes. Those are closed questions, not getting a lot of detail. If you want a little bit more, that doctor could say, where does it hurt? And that is an open question. There's a whole range of bodily responses to this, but it confines the expectations of the answer a little bit. Or what do you like about that book? Is an open question. It's a much better question than do you like that book? But what do you like about that book also constrains the response to being just about that book. And then if we push the question even wider open, the doctor could ask, tell me about your experience and what you're feeling. And then the patient feels like they have the freedom to elaborate. They can talk about where their pain is and the circumstances in which they find themselves in pain. And maybe from that, the doctor's able to make a diagnosis differently than they might have otherwise. Or we have Vita's questions. What kind of characters do you like? That opens up the ranges of responses to be much wider. Still about reading, still on topic, but much wider response. So think about how to take an open question and push the edges a little more, push it, widen that jaw to get it even more open so that you have those moments like the William Isaacs quote, where you get to the conversation that you never imagined when you began talking with someone else. And then our third quality is the questions have to make space for emotions and experience. We have to remember that people are thinkers and feelers. And so often, especially at work, we tend to ask questions as if we're only operating with our logical side, or as if someone's experience isn't valid or isn't being acknowledged. And so how can we move the conversation then in the direction of productive and positive emotions so that people don't feel as if their experience are being gaslit, basically? I was on a team, I was helping a client develop their strategy it was last year about this time, and they wanted to grow their goals for the organization, but the team members were feeling really burnt out. They were struggling even to make that year's goals. And so when our strategy session began with the CEO, unbeknownst to me, announcing, we're increasing our goals next year by 10%, how are you going to do it? The team immediately felt deflated. We can barely make this year's goals. What do we mean we have to make this year's goals and grow by 10%? It's just impossible. We're burnt out as it is. That CEO would have been much better served by making space for emotions and experience. And by saying something more like, I know this year's had ups and downs and we're all tired, but we want to build new ways of working. How can we build new ways of working so that we can increase our goals without burning ourselves out? And that, I think, would have led to a more productive conversation. Or imagine you have an elderly parent and you realize you need to think about their end of life planning. And you could just very bluntly say, what do you want your funeral to be like? But I think in most families, that conversation probably wouldn't go over well. And so we add a little preamble and we say things like, I know this is an awkward topic, but I realized I don't really know what you want as you age or after you pass away. And so I wonder if we could talk about what it would be like for you to have a funeral that felt like really reflected you, really honored you. Now, depending on your parent, it might still be an awkward conversation, but you're going to get there a lot faster to the conversation you want by starting with this making space for emotions and acknowledging experience. And one final example, imagine you can see that your colleague is sort of antsy about something. You can tell they're sitting on a comment they want to make, and you could just push them, what's your idea? And push them to suggest it. Or you could say, I know this topic matters to you and I can tell you have something on your mind. Tell me about your idea. And that acknowledges how important it is to them. It makes space for them to be a thinker and a feeler, and it acknowledges their experience. So it makes your questions longer. It takes a little bit of a preamble, but people feel seen in the process when we make space for those questions and experience, or for those emotions and experience. So we've made it halfway through our hierarchy of better question quality, and I bet you probably have some questions yourself. So we're going to pause here for a second, and I want to give you a chance to ask questions of how to use the three qualities we've discussed before. You can put them in chat or raise your hand. And while I'm waiting to see if any questions come in, I want to address some questions that I would ask if I were in your seat, questions you might be asking. Do I have to do this in every conversation? Do I have to use all 6 qualities in every question? And do I always have to be positive? And the answer to all of them is no. The toll booth clerk doesn't want anything more of a question from you than a head nod or sort of a rhetorical, how you doing? And that's fine. I have a neighbor who I know I can only ask a sincere question of her when I really have time to stop and talk. It's fine. You don't have to do this in every conversation. And in terms of trying to use all the 6 qualities in every conversation, doing that would actually lead to some weird conversations. But you can try to use all 6 qualities across an extended conversation or over a team's planning process or a team's debrief process so that you get to richer dialogue. And then finally, do I always have to be positive? No, you don't always have to be positive, but I think a good rule of thumb, which is kind of based in some research, is to allow yourself one negative question for every 5 positive questions. And by negative, I don't mean what were you thinking? I mean something more like what went wrong in that client presentation, to just help people reflect a little bit more. And so Brenda has a good question. Do we need to be ready for conversations to go off kilter? Sort of like Covey said, think first, understand before being understood. Yeah, you do have to be prepared to go for the conversation to go places that you didn't ask before or that you didn't anticipate before. And I think that that's okay. It's okay if that happens. But one of the things leaders can do is put boundaries on it. And maybe you don't want to push the question fully wide so that I'm asking you to fully reimagine our operating system. Maybe we want to focus on improvements within the existing operating system we have. So think about the boundaries of how far you can push the conversation. But also, don't shut yourself off from hearing the thing that wouldn't have been heard if you didn't ask a very wide open question. I hope that helps. And then Dave said, what comes first, asking the broader and more open questions or creating a culture where employees feel empowered to share their feelings and be open and candid? Or he says, put another way, isn't the ability to ask these questions driven broadly by organizational culture? It's at least driven by your team culture. I would certainly agree with that. And my guess is if you're here in the Small Giants community, that you are probably already trying to lead with a positive culture, a focus on people, a place with psychological safety and using your emotional intelligence. So yes, that's absolutely table stakes to come into the conversation and ask big questions. And if you feel like you don't have the trust of the team, then that's a good question for you to ask. What would it take for me to earn your trust? Great. Any other questions? All right. To move us into the final 3 points, I want to start with a story. A few years ago, or actually over the course of the last decade or so, I've worked pretty frequently with the same manufacturing company. And this company used to be a leader, industry leader in innovation in their field. But about a decade before I started working with them was the last time they'd had any new products. And that failure to innovate was starting to show up in their sales numbers. And so not surprisingly, they were asking questions like, are sales dropping again? Or why are we so bad at innovation? And those questions weren't helping them be better at innovation. So they brought me and a few colleagues in to help. And we got all their engineers into a room. And for a few hours, we asked them different questions. And the questions we asked were things like this. When have we been at our best around innovation? Which assumes positive regard. It assumes that people in the organization know how to do innovation. We just need to remember it. We asked, imagine 3 years from now, we're known as the leading engineers and thinkers in our field. What would have changed? Pushes the question wider open. How could our organizational chart support innovation? So instead of people saying, I don't have time, what could we do that would make time? How could you make more time for innovation? And those are better questions. And they stopped placing blame and they showed positive regard. And they became more open to acknowledging experience. And they started to move towards the next characteristics in our pyramid. And I'm really happy to report that the organization came up with several new ways to support innovation. And I think they're still thriving today. So I'll continue to give you some examples of questions that they asked as we work through the next 3 qualities of better questions. The next one is shift perspectives. And I think this is honestly my favorite of all of the qualities because it's the one where you come up with the most new ideas, the freshest takes on things. And there are 4 perspective shifts that I find particularly useful, and they happen usually in both directions. The first is to shift from short-term thinking to shift to a longer-term thinking, or vice versa, to go from longer-term thinking into the more immediate. The second shift is to think about if we're facing a lot of things we can't control, we're in one of those uncertainty ruts, to think about what we can control. The third shift is to shift from thinking about individuals to thinking about the broader system, or vice versa. When we get stuck with the system, think instead about its impact to individuals. And then the fourth one, and this is so useful in our own minds, and the questions we're asking ourselves, is to go from judging to learning, to go from, sort of blaming and condemning ourselves and thinking that we're not good enough, to asking what we're learning, how we're growing, and to shift our thinking that way. So we've got examples here to work through. You could ask, if you're asking the question, does this plan make sense for the next year? You could also pause and ask, how does this plan position us for 10 years from now? And you can see how that would lead to a different conversation and provide a good check on the plan that you're creating. Instead of asking, how do we change gender norms in society, which is a very important question, but something that's hard for any of us as individuals to control, you could say, what steps can I take to change gender norms in my own family? So if it's something that you really care about, take it from systems to individual, take it from what you can't control to what you can control. There's an organization I've worked with that was asking, is this the benefits package that's right for our company? And that was a great question for them to ask. It was a really good one, but they needed to also ask, who will this benefits package not serve well? And ask that question to look at the individuals in the system and how that could play out. And you may be noting that not serve well makes it a negative question, but that's okay. You've earned it with 5 positive questions. So every once in a while you can drop in one of those that looks at the negative. And then, why are we so bad at innovation? This is the question the manufacturing firm was asking. Instead of that, what organizational changes would help us be good at innovation? A different question that moves us to more productive results. So shifting perspective, like I said, one of my absolute favorites. And then we get to unlocking possibilities. And this is all about pushing the edges of the conversation, going more open in a way that asks people to imagine, that moves out of the current reality to think of something new. So how do we fix our failure to innovate was the question they were asking. And they changed it to, imagine it's 3 years from now and we really are innovating, we're leading the industry. What would be new or different? It's amazing what that simple question, and you can steal it and use it in your own context, all the ideas that it can help you uncover. Is Tamara or Tom the right leader for the team? You're promoting somebody into leadership for the team. Who's the right one? And you can ask instead, or you can ask yourself as part of that process, imagine the team a year from now under Tamara's leadership. What would be different than under Tom's? To help you compare and contrast and actually imagine the future. Or personally, if you're asking, should I take this new job? You could ask, what do I imagine life would be like in a year if I did? That's also sort of shifting the timeframes that helps you get past that awkward transition so that you could think about a future where you're not feeling all of that learning curve. Unlocking possibilities, any question, it's just using any question that pushes people to imagine. All right, the final quality of a good question is that it's about something significant. It's about something meaningful. It's about something both people care about. It's got an eye on win-wins. One example I use of this is when my kids were 5 and 6 or so, they really wanted to get into collecting Pokemon cards. And I wasn't really excited about all that in my house or playing that game, but I knew it was important to them. And then I looked for a way to make it important for me. And we decided that they could start collecting Pokemon cards when they could read them to themselves, because getting them to be better readers was important to me. And so the cards were important to them, the reading was important to me. It was a win-win. So how do we frame questions and push our questions to reach that self-actualization point, that point of significance? Maybe you want to ask your boss, well, we get to raise salaries for the team this year, but you know your boss is focused on innovation, to go back to that last question. Then you could frame it in terms of what his desires are. I know you've focused on innovation. What would it look like to tie innovation to salary raises? How can you get both the things you want out of it? Or maybe you're in an organization like so many are right now that are looking for ways to cut costs. And those conversations can be so deflating, but they become a little bit more significant when you think of it as enabling you to keep the priorities you do want. So what do we have to say no to in order to say yes to our priorities? Again, you're just making it about the thing that matters to you. And then finally, are our customers renewing with their sale, with the packages? And we can reframe it to, are our customers seeing the results they want? And that might help us answer whether they're renewing in the way that we want them to. All right, is significant. You've now walked through all of the different aspects of the 6 qualities of the pyramid: positive, open, makes space for emotions and experience, shifts perspectives, and unlocks possibilities. And I see we have a little bit of conversation going at the chat. I would love for you to put questions into the chat or raise your hand, but I'd also love for you to look back at that list of conversations you identified earlier as being in the ruts and think of anything that you might use here that's helpful. Is anything helpful? If so, I'd love to hear about it in chat or in if you'd come off mute. And while we're doing that, let's look at, and also again, add your questions to chat here. We have Brenda's question: does it help to start meetings with a quick round robin update? Like, what is something you're grateful for today? Or what's going on in your world? Just to get people to be open to one another for conversation. Oh, Brenda, that is a hot topic. I would love to know your opinion on that. I see Jill saying that it sets a great tone for the meeting. And so I'm curious if anybody has a strong opinion on this, because people really do have strong feelings about icebreaker questions. I happen to be a large proponent of them, and I like them for 2 reasons. One, it sets it loosens everyone's voice up. It lets them know that they're expected to talk. Everybody's supposed to have something to say, and it just gives them an experience to do that. And 2, it increases interpersonal knowing on our teams. And we know that non-work related conversations are actually characteristics of teams that are high performing, that they know how to have conversations about things other than work. It creates a sense of trust with each other that's useful. So my answer is yes. But you also have to pick, there are meetings where it's not appropriate. If it's your 4th meeting of the day with the same group of people, maybe you don't need to do that. Or if it's a meeting where everybody's really just wanting to know if they're getting laid off, it's probably not great to start with what is something you're grateful for today. So reading the room, always useful. Yeah, okay, we've got some questions coming in, and it doesn't have to be in chat. Feel free to come off mute and we can talk. Yeah, I agree, Estee, that sometimes it isn't the best use of the time that you have. But, keeping conversation going is important too. Someone says, excited to unlock possibilities by asking the weekly meeting group what we might imagine taking on and results. Ooh, that's a good one. What can we take on? I love that language of taking on too, because it's like, it's got a lot of positive intent to it. Adam says, do you ever run the risk of the other person feeling like it's an interrogation? One thing I often say when talking about this is you have to give as good as you get. So for every question you ask, you have to be prepared to be honest and vulnerable and share. As leaders, sometimes we have to do that last so that other people get their thoughts out there. But yeah, you don't want it to be an interview. You're in a relationship, you're not a journalist. And at the same time, the questions do help you increase your knowing, increase your liking. Jill's tip for, I think this is probably related to icebreakers, is that it's important that a question like that not be mandatory, that people feel comfortable. Yeah, I think that's important. Eric says, I think consciously trying to shift perspectives is a great idea. I was once wrestling with a big question and someone asked me, if you imagine your 85-year-old self looking back on this time in your life, what would that 85-year-old wish you had done? Ooh, Eric, are you able to tell us a little more about that experience?
Yeah, I feel like when I at least wrestle with a big question, I get really mired in the experience of uncertainty. And so thinking of that much larger time scale really helped me to focus on the things that really mattered to me and that I imagined would matter to me at that age. So it pulled me. I think shifts in time and in scale and in scope, I don't naturally do it. And so to be reminded like, oh, that's one way to supercharge your questions, it's very helpful for me.
Yeah. I completely agree. And it's helpful to have in your back pocket the idea of the different shifts you can make. I find, and maybe you're all this, if you are coaching somebody on your team, if you're helping a manager in your organization to figure out how to manage their team, it's often easier to see what to do than when you're in the same position yourself. And that's because you can get on the balcony for other people, but it's really hard to do that for ourselves. And those shifts in perspectives help us get up on the balcony and take a different view. Yeah. Bruce asks, if today's constraints didn't exist, what would we do next? I love that. That gives us a chance to think blue sky and ask, what of today's constraints can we ignore? What are really relevant? What do we have to be constrained by? I love it. All right. Any other questions or comments? Ooh, I like Brenda's comment. She likes asking, when she was a math teacher, she would ask for possible answers to the question rather than the answer, which made things safe. Sometimes when I'm in a group like this, it's sort of a similar question. Instead of asking any questions, I'll say, ask me a good question, which sort of does the same thing. It challenges people to put a question out there. All right. Well, we want to wrap in time for you to take a break before your meeting at the top of the hour. And so I want to close with some poetry, which is, I'm not a big poetry person, as anyone who knows me well can probably guess, but don't worry, this is a haiku. So it's very, very short. And just so you remember, haikus are a form of poetry that's 3 lines of 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. And the haiku is this: talk less and ask more. Your advice is not as good as you think it is. Talk less and ask more. Your advice is not as good as you think it is. And that that haiku comes from Michael Bungay Steiner, who wrote The Coaching Habit, which is a great book if you do any coaching in your work. And he says he could summarize his entire book, The Coaching Habit, in that little 5-7-5, 3 stanzas. We know that high-performing teams ask as many questions as they do offer arguments for their own perspective, and we know that making someone feel heard is really the first step to better work relationships. And we also know that the folks we love the most deserve something more from us than those ruts. And so I hope, if nothing else, you'll ask more questions after today, and that you'll have some ideas about how you might go about doing that. And I'd love to hear from you as I develop and refine these ideas. I'm hoping to start a newsletter and then parlay that into a book in 2024. And so if you have thoughts on how to refine these ideas, drop me an email. And if you'd like to stay updated on the book and newsletter, I think Bridget from the Small Giants team will drop this link into the chat, or they'll send it with the follow-up materials. But I'd love if you just sign up. It hasn't started. It's a new thing. So I'm working on figuring it out. So I certainly won't be spamming your inbox, but I find so much value in good questions. I want us to get more out of them. And I think the place to start is by asking how we get more out of those questions, starting with how are you, so that we can be better than fine. So thank you, everybody, for joining me here today. I'm grateful for your participation.
Thank you so much, Amber. A round of applause for Amber on Zoom here. Thank you so much for your time. We are going to follow up with notes, the recording, a couple of resources, and you guys can share it with your colleagues and your teammates. Just 2 quick announcements from the Small Giants community, in that the next virtual event is happening at the end of this month on March 28th, and it's on marketing strategies for purpose-driven organizations. And Bridget just dropped the link on that. Also, just 60 days away is the Small Giants Conference, which is happening in Detroit, May 2nd to 4th. I know many of you are joining us, but if that's something that's top of mind for you, check out the agenda, check out the program. It's going to be a wonderful gathering of other small giants, so we'd love to see you there. Be well, everybody. We'll see you next month. Take care.